Hello, my name is Rabbi Burt Visotzky. I am the director of the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue at the Jewish Theological Seminary, and I want to welcome you to this Martin Luther King birthday lecture. Today, the Reverend King would have turned 92 years old had he not been tragically taken from us in 1968. I am very delighted that we are able today to have as our speaker the executive pastor of the Reverend King's Church, the Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, and that is my good friend, John Vaughn. John, we're eager to hear you, but since this is a good Jewish event, there has to be, I get to introduce someone who gets to introduce you. And the person who is our introducer has been a member of our committee, Sherrill Moss-Solomon. Sherrill has worked for JTS almost 18 years now, and before she came to JTS, she was a financial manager at IBM. She's been married for 17 years, so I guess coming to JTS was a good thing for you, Sherrill. To Nathan Solomon, she has a son, Justin. She has been a resident of our Harlem community for over 50 years, active in her community and her church. Sherrill, please do the honors. Once you unmute. All right, you do have to unmute, but otherwise we see you.
Sherrill, I sent you a request to unmute. I'll send you another one.
As will be obvious to everyone on this call, we have muted all of you. There are literally hundreds of you on the call, and just the principals will be unmuted. And while Sherrill is trying to unmute herself, I will say that during the course of the lecture and following the lecture, I will be engaging in some conversation with the Reverend Vaughn. In any of that period, should any of you have questions, you can put them in the chat. You will notice that your chat is disabled. The only thing you can chat to is the Milstein Center, the Milstein Center for Interreligious Dialogue, which in this case is Margot Hughes Robinson. Margot Hughes Robinson is our programming coordinator, and I want to publicly acknowledge her. Without her, we really could do nothing. And I'm endlessly grateful, Margot, to all that you do. And I know the Jewish community is exceptionally grateful that come May, you will be ordained a rabbi. But for now, Sherrill, you can give your introduction, please.
Wonderful. Thank you, Burt, for those very kind. Good afternoon, JTS family, friends from all over North America. A great pleasure to introduce our esteemed guests on this virtual birthday. Having our guest speaker from the nostalgic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta, Georgia, the home church of Dr. King, is especially, but it is also very meaningful for me, as I was born and raised in Montgomery, Alabama, during the time when Dr. King was fighting for civil rights. My mother, God rest her soul, Lucille Moss, worked for Dr. King during the civil rights movement and was very active. She would tell me the stories of the marches and the sit-ins that she participated in. Although I was a very young girl at the time, I can remember vividly the struggles my family endured while we lived in Alabama. You can only imagine how life was living in the South and having to endure such struggles at that time. But we're not here to talk about me. At this time, I would like to read a short bio on our esteemed guests. Reverend John Vaughn is completing his first year as executive pastor of Ebenezer Baptist Church, known for its former pastor, Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Ebenezer is part of the Martin Luther King Jr. Historical Park and serves a congregation of more than 6,000 members. Before joining Ebenezer, Reverend Vaughn served as executive vice president at Auburn Theological Seminary in New York, where he led overall strategic planning and management as the seminary worked to build communities and pursue justice. Reverend Vaughn writes and lectures frequently on issues related to justice, race, economic equity, education, and community building. JTS community, family, friends from all over North America, join me in welcoming Reverend John Vaughn.
Well, it's good to be with you today, and thank you so much for that introduction, Sherrill. I want to also say thank you to my good friend Burt Visotzky for this invitation. To Margot Hughes Robinson, I would agree, this does not happen without you. We have had our own version of you here at Ebenezer. And without her, we would not have been able to make it through this pandemic. Grateful to have a chance to be here. And I've seen a few other familiar faces and friends that are here on the Zoom call. I'm sorry that we can't be together in person, but know that, but I feel your spirit and your presence, and glad that you are here. And to others, welcome. It's good to be with you today. So the title of what I want to share today is called The Relentless Pursuit of Justice. So in the film Bottle Shock, directed by Randall Miller in 2008, he tells a story of how Northern California wines bested French wines in a blind taste test in 1974. In the movie, much is made of Northern California's terroir, its soil. There's a uniqueness of the soil, and in combination with the weather, it makes for growing perfect grapes that then leads to quality wines. The terroir is about what one cannot see with the plain eye, but it's a unique chemistry of the soil in that specific location. The notion of terroir is also true for congregations, for organizations, and communities that we work with. In my time at Auburn Seminary there in New York, part of its terroir in its 1800s of upstate New York birthed its ability to leave that area in the 1930s and reinvent itself when it moved in at Union Seminary up until about 5 years ago. In its terroir that nurtured a spirit of entrepreneurism, that prepared leaders for the frontiers of the then expanding United States. It's the spirit of experimentation and pushing boundaries that had really been in the DNA of Auburn as it grew amidst a culture of theological education that was largely stuck in old models of doing its work with very sporadic innovation. In February 2020, I accepted the call to serve as the executive pastor here at the historic Ebenezer Baptist Church in Atlanta. It's the spiritual home of the Reverend Martin Luther King Sr. and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., and is known as America's Freedom Church. As a result of its connection to the Reverend Dr. King Jr., many nationally and globally associate the church as a home for the civil rights movement. What many people inside and outside of Atlanta do not realize is that Black faith-rooted social justice and empowerment is in the terroir, the DNA of Ebenezer. Founded in 1886, 9 years after Reconstruction ended, the church was organized under the leadership of the Reverend John A. Parker, who was a freedman. The second pastor of the church, the Reverend A.D. Williams, built on this spirit of independence by promoting Black businesses, urging members to become homeowners, and battled for adequate public accommodations for Blacks despite Jim Crow segregation laws. When Martin Luther King Sr. served as an assistant to Reverend Williams and was also the pastor's son-in-law. When Reverend Williams stepped down, Reverend King became the next senior pastor in 1931. And during his tenure, he too encouraged Black ownership. In addition, he served as the head of the Atlanta NAACP. He stressed the need for an educated, politically active Black ministry. He was a champion of voting rights and provided critical leadership in the ending of Jim Crow laws in Georgia. So this context helps one understand that the terroir for Dr. King, he was raised in a family and in a church context that saw social justice as an essential part to what it meant to be a Christian. His championing of voting rights, civil and human rights, combined with his meaningful scholarship as a public theologian that taught, preached, and acted a spirituality of unconditional love, did not arise by accident. In 1976, his brave, prophetic articulation of the interconnectedness of militarism, poverty, and racism at the Riverside Church, which lost him some very influential friends and supporters, sprung forth from a terroir that had been developed generations before him. In Pastor Warnock's 15 years here as a senior pastor at Ebenezer, he's continued to build on this legacy through the church's current social justice focus on supporting voter empowerment, fighting voter suppression, ending mass incarceration, strengthening the poverty safety net, universal access to healthcare, and dismantling the school to prison pipeline. This public ministry will now be extended to the United States Senate, and for that we are grateful and excited. But Ebenezer has been both the terroir for nurturing and developing important public leaders, as well as generations of devoted and committed lay leaders who live this theology daily. The church is built on the terroir of ancestors who gave their time, their talent, and treasure for this mission of the congregation. It is a terroir of Black independence and integrity, of Black self-determination and mutual support, of Black talent and excellence, of Black spirituality and transformation. In a pre-COVID-19 world, visitors from all over the globe would flock to Ebenezer and our neighboring institutions, the King Center and the National Park Service, along with the tombs of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. What is clear is that this part of what is known as Sweet Auburn neighborhood is not just a tourist attraction, but it serves as holy ground for a range of activists and justice seekers. This terroir of Ebenezer is best illustrated by a story that involves the National Basketball Association of all places, the NBA, and players Malcolm Brogdon and Jaylen Brown. After the killing of George Floyd and the first night of protest in Atlanta that saw a handful of people engage in the destruction of property, Brogdon and Brown put out a call on social media for people to join them at Ebenezer Baptist Church in our neighborhood at the graveside of Martin Luther King Jr. and Coretta Scott King. Jaylen Brown drove from Boston, Massachusetts to Atlanta and was present that very next day. The essence of their invitation was to rebut any acts of violence and engage in a peaceful march opposing the death of unarmed Black men and women at the hands of law enforcement and white vigilantes. In this instance, and in many others, Ebenezer has embodied its name as literally the stone of help, a touchstone to remember that nonviolent protest is one of the most powerful tools that we have. So my parents met in Massachusetts. My mother was pursuing her doctorate in psychology at Clark University in Worcester. And my father was at Boston University in the doctoral program for physics. He actually used to play ping pong with Martin Luther King when Dr. King was getting his doctorate in theology. My parents met and left school early on when my father was recruited to be one of the first Black senior managers at IBM in Poughkeepsie, New York, which became my birthplace. Fast forward to a few years later to living in New Jersey, and my brother was born. And about 6 months after, then made the choice to return back to Worcester, Massachusetts, to Clark University and complete her PhD. So in addition to a Black extended family support system, was a network of my mother's white classmates and friends who were mostly white and mostly Jewish. It was not until my adulthood that I realized how significant this web of support was in terms of our family's well-being. I was a child in the 1960s and the 1970s and spent afternoons, evenings, and overnights in the homes of white families who didn't give it a second thought to be fully welcoming of our family into their homes. No undercurrents of bias, no animosity, as my brother and I played with their male and female children, ate at the same tables, slept in the same rooms. My parents also loved to host parties. Our house was the party house. And attendees was this incredibly racially diverse and class diverse group of folks that would gather in our living room and throughout our house with lots of food, adult beverages, with music, laughter, and many, many, many stories. But in those times, it was the seeds of this Black-Jewish relationship that were in the terroir of my experience of growing up. The support of many in the Jewish community for the civil rights movement is an important part of the story of Black-Jewish partnerships and is well documented. From Abraham Heschel marching with Dr. King, to Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner with James Chaney putting their very lives on the line as they were murdered in Mississippi. Jewish and Black donors coming together to invest in this life-changing work. It's a story of collective faith-rooted justice that is inspirational and played a critical role in the changing of America. So fast forward to today. We're at a major inflection moment in Black-Jewish relations. Though the boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or BDS movement was gaining momentum in the United States, including in some Black faith circles, the killing of Michael Brown and the Ferguson uprising was a key turning point. When Palestinian youth came to the aid of Black youth in Missouri, with the help of the World Wide Web showing ways to make homemade gas masks and sharing strategies for standing against aggressive police tactics, a new partnership was born. The leaders in Ferguson became vocal allies for the Palestinian struggle and critics of Israel in the United States. They didn't have the same history of the Black-Jewish relationships that I had for my generation. So here we are at a major intersection of Black-Jewish relations in the United States. You have my folks in my generation who have grown up and lived one experience of Black-Jewish relations. You have folks in their 20s and 30s who have a different lived experience of Black-Jewish relations. If there were an immediate answer or quick fixes to this, it would have been solved by now. So what do we do? Well, first and foremost, I think the most important thing we can do is we can stay engaged and commit to being in relationship. This means we've got to roll up our sleeves. We have to continue to get to know each other and be willing to ask each other the tough questions and offer the tough answers with each other without leaving the room. I remember when the Movement for Black Lives platform came out, and it said some very harsh words about Israel. One response was to call the movement anti-Semitic, demonize them, and find new partners. Another response, which my former organization, Auburn, chose, was to help create and facilitate a conversation among Movement for Black Lives leaders and members of the Jewish social justice community. What was most notable was that the core facilitation was led by Jews of color. Talk about being between a rock and a hard place. It was a time to listen. It was a time to share. It was a time to reflect. No easy answers, but agree to be in the room together. As a mentor of mine once jokingly said, if you're not at the table, you're probably on the menu. The work of social justice is navigating the gray areas and figuring out what we can do and cannot do together. My good friends at the Shalom Hartman Institute have been walking this journey in creating the tables for Jewish, Muslim, Christian engagement, as well as my former organization, Auburn, through its Senior Fellows program. But deep relationship building is just the beginning. The other is that we have to commit to walk the journey together and work together in ways that the humanity and integrity of all people is valued, affirmed, and supported. This means we have to create a way forward that doesn't really exist. So to borrow a few familiar phrases, we have to make the road by walking, or we need to build the plane while we fly it. The Movement for Black Lives is not the civil rights movement. The Jewish social justice movement in 2021 is not the Jewish social justice movement of 1965. These are new movements, new players, new relationships, new dynamics. But I think that our ability to remake these relationships is in our terroir. In the spring of 2018, when I was the executive vice president at Auburn, my boss asked me to work with Pastor Warnock and Ebenezer Baptist Church on a conference that would gather faith communities to learn more about the ways to end mass incarceration in the United States. After the first few meetings, it was clear that a conference was a good idea, but that what we really wanted to do was to catalyze a faith-rooted response to reduce the mass incarceration of Black, brown, and poor people. Ebenezer and Auburn then invited long-term friend, The Temple, also based in Atlanta, to serve as one of the core leaders with us in launching this national effort. So from June 17th to 19th in 2019 here in Atlanta, the Multi-Faith Initiative to End Mass Incarceration, known as EMI, held our first conference, Let My People Go, Ending Mass Incarceration. We expected to maybe have a few hundred people. Well, our multi-faith, multiracial gathering drew over 400 registered for the conference, along with many others that weren't registered, with attendees from 27 different states. In addition, we had over 1,000 people attend our opening session that featured Dr. Michelle Alexander, the author of the new Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness, along with Pastor Warnock. Today, EMI is a national effort that is at various levels of engagement in 6 regions: New York, Georgia, Texas, Arkansas, Wisconsin, and Southern California. We also have a partnership with the music industry through Calling All Crows, a nonprofit created by the band Dispatch. EMI's focus is threefold. It's increasing the number of faith communities engaged in some action focused on ending mass incarceration. It's shifting the narrative and theology around the ways that we talk about and engage the issue. And we increase the engagement of faith communities involved in policy change. Our work in New York has actually launched a few months ago when Central Synagogue agreed to be our local partner And with the help of the Loeb Family Foundation, we've been able to hire a local faith leader, the Reverend John Ducksworth, who has direct experience with the criminal legal system. This local focus is also conducting a landscape analysis of faith-rooted groups engaged in the work and is launching a pilot narrative development and media training effort. So for more information, you can reach John through Central Synagogue or through our website, www.endingmassincarceration.com. But this is a multi-faith effort. It's Christians, it's Muslims, it's Jews, it's others, whose core has been a Black-Jewish partnership between Ebenezer and the Temple, which now includes a third partner, Odyssey Impact. It has been an experience of making the road while walking, building the plane while we fly it. But what's important to note is that what made the establishment and launch of EMI possible was the long time between Ebenezer and the Temple, that including the relationship that has been built between Pastor Warnock and the Temple's senior rabbi, Peter Burt, and relationships that even predated them. And today, one of the core key relationships of this effort is between myself and Rabbi Berg's colleague, the Rabbi Lydia Medwin. The reality is we have to figure this out. The Black-Jewish partnership of 2021 must be rebuilt because our mutual survival is dependent on it. The issues of injustice that are before us transcend our divisions. If we can't find a way to build new Black-Jewish relationships, if the Jewish-Palestinian conflict is allowed to fester without resolution, these disconnects will undermine everything that we do. And we're already seeing it happen in various social movements over the last handful of years. I would even go so far to say that we no longer have a choice. If we don't find a way forward in terms of reknitting the Black-Jewish partnership, then we will all lose. Just witness what we saw on Capitol Hill in DC a day after a Black clergy person and a Jewish filmmaker are elected to represent Georgia in the US Senate. Blacks and Jews were both on the menu, if you will. We have to find and develop tables, meetings, and other avenues that build deeper relationships across lines of difference with intentionality and engage in action together so that our words and our thoughts start to inhabit our bones and our souls. Through this level of engagement, true individual and social transformation, the changing of hearts and minds, including our own, is possible. I believe it is in our collective terroir to be able to do this. We can do this. But let us be clear. Injustice is relentless. Injustice is relentless. Racism, anti-Semitism, sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, it is relentless. My wife shared with me an article by Michael Harriot in The Root that I thought was a good summary of some of my own feelings about the siege of white supremacists on the Capitol last week. That this rickety house we call a democracy could be fractured by a few arbitrary stones heaved by wobbly armed cowards, emboldened by a mob mentality, fueled by a feckless egomaniac. Luckily, Black people have come up with a name for this unsettling hangover that white people are experiencing. Thursday. On Wednesday, everyone was suddenly astonished, as if they had no idea that some white people did this all the time, as if there was no Charlottesville, as if the White Lives Matter march never happened, as if there was no such thing as a Proud Boy, as if the president hadn't been telegraphing this for 4 years. He then goes on to say the rest of the world was stunned by this wholly unremarkable thing that always happens. Black people, however, watch this with the same eyes we used to watch Kenosha County District Attorney Michael Gravely announced that Kenosha police officer Rustin Shesky would not be charged for shooting Jacob Blake in the back 7 times at point blank range. We swallowed it with the same mouths that whistled while Wisconsin, Georgia, Arizona, and Michigan specifically counted and recounted the votes from where we live, insinuating ain't no way that they voted the same percentage as white people. How could they fill out those absentee ballots? Those Black people must be up to something. Injustice is relentless. So recently I've been thinking about the wind. I've been thinking about the winds of the world and the wind of the divine. In Genesis, it's the Ruach that hovers over the waters of creation. In the Christian New Testament, it's the rush of the Holy Spirit on Pentecost. There have been a lot of crosswinds in this political season, blowing left and blowing right. And there have indeed been those in this season that have followed the winds of what they felt was politically expedient versus their values and core beliefs. Once again, we have witnessed the ease with which Black people have been thrown under the bus when someone feels it is in their best interest to do so. Kelly Loeffler was a supportive owner of the Atlanta Dream, their WNBA Women's National Basketball Association team, and most of its members being Black women who felt very positive about Kelly Loeffler. But when she wanted to curry favor with the outgoing president and wanted to be more attractive to his supporters in Georgia for her run to keep her appointed Senate seat, she did not think twice about tossing these very same Black women under the bus by denouncing the team's embrace of the Black Lives Matter movement. Now, some have argued that it was this moment that actually fueled Pastor Warnock's ascendancy in the Senate race when the players later that week adorned Vote Warnock t-shirts. The prevailing winds that we collectively must deal with are the ones where systems, structures, and policies are still supporting the consolidation of wealth among the wealthy, while those who are poor are continually told that their lot in life is their fault. There is a prevailing wind that still sees unarmed Black men and women killed by law enforcement and white vigilantes as yet another isolated incident. And to add insult to injury, many of who do the killing remain unaccountable for their actions. Though some police departments have redeployed resources, budgets for law enforcement have held steady, and in some cases they've increased. Was this spring and summer what Charles Blow called the social justice Coachella, where the marches were mere theater and COVID cabin fever rather than protests? Is there true sustained commitment to justice? Are some people and systems ready to give something up in ways that build equity and equality for others? Though COVID has given the earth a temporary reprieve from the pressure we put on it, the prevailing wind is one where climate change is real and the negative impact on our planet continues. Though in many important ways the election matters, in other ways it has not changed the work that is before us to change the prevailing winds of this world. So how do we change the wind? These winds can be overwhelming and elusive. They can be co-opting and seductive. They can be resilient and morphing. They are dangerous and lethal. To do the work that is before us, Blacks and Jews, we need each other. And together, we must be relentless. We must be relentless in our sense of focus on the structures, systems, and policy, and the people who are invested in the way that things are. We've got to do our homework. We need to understand the landscape that causes and facilitates these prevailing winds, and we have to be smart. The negative results that we live with today are not by accident, but the result of design and intentionality. We have to be relentless in our embrace of wisdom. One of the great lessons that the Black Lives Matter movement learned is that when you get too powerful, those who are threatened go after the leaders. It's been really interesting to see the hatred and even some of the death threats that have started to come at Pastor Warnock when you actually read social media. But this has often led to attempts to discredit leaders by labeling them communist and socialist. Sound familiar? And in some cases, those that have been killed, thereby weakening movements. Black Lives Matter made their decision that we're all leaders. So therefore they operate as a collective. No one voice is greater than the other. We have to be relentless in our persistence. We need to be like the woman in the Christian New Testament who demands justice from the unjust judge. She's in his face and she wears him down. It's important that the prevailing winds of this world know that they must deal with us and we are not going away. We must wear them down. But we have to also be relentless in our trust in God. As people of faith, we know the power of this lesson. Our commitment to justice is an essential part of what it means to be a person of faith. Our God is a God of transformation. Our God is a God of new beginnings, a God of creativity and possibilities. Our God specializes in making a way out of no way. In Genesis, God's Spirit hovering over the water. It's an important step in the creation of the world and ultimately humanity. In Acts 2, the wind of Pentecost rushes through and people are given power and abilities beyond their imagination. People are empowered and lives are transformed. We cannot change the prevailing winds of this world without the presence of the wind of God's Spirit. The wind of God's Spirit creates and transforms. It disrupts and allows for new beginnings. It shakes things up and calls us forth to be our best selves. Black-Jewish relations needs a reboot. But together, as people of faith and moral courage, we are called to change the prevailing winds of this world and be agents of unleashing the wind of the Spirit. Focus, wisdom, persistence, trust. These are our tools for changing the wind, and we must be relentless. I love that moment when Moses is standing next to the Red Sea, and he's wondering, how is he going to get out of this situation? He's got the water on one side, he's got the Egyptian army bearing down with him on the other side. And then God says to him, Moses, what's that in your hand? And he sees his staff. As we stare out at the prevailing winds of this world that want to topple and uproot us, when it feels like we are surrounded, when it feels like our lives are on the line, what is in our hands? Our focus, our wisdom, our persistence, our trust. The one thing I know for sure is that the prevailing winds of structural racism, classism, anti-Semitism, environmental degradation, inequality, they show no signs of abating anytime soon. So my question to us today, brothers and sisters, is what is in our hands? What is in our hands? Now let us then be relentless and change the wind. Amen.
Amen. John, I thank you for not only a brilliant lecture, but a heavy challenge to us all, that if we are to move forward, we need to do it together. And in order to do it together, there's a lot of work to do. We always at the Jewish Theological Seminary invoke that beautiful moment when the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and Abraham Joshua Heschel, our teacher, marched together. We're very proud of the fact that in 1964, the Jewish Theological Seminary gave an honorary degree to the Reverend King. But that was a long time ago. And as you have pointed out, it has been a difficult time. The Black and Jewish communities have drifted apart, sometimes for very good reasons and sometimes for not so good reasons. And I'm prepared to take up your challenge. You gave a beautiful metaphor of Moses standing at the sea, putting forth his rod to part the waters. And of course, the parting of the waters is one of the great metaphors that Dr. King used. But if I may share a midrash with you, I am, after all, a professor of midrash, interpretation of the Bible. The rabbis tell a story that when Moses stood at the sea and he put forth the rod, nothing happened. And he was concerned. So he looked for a volunteer. And one of the princes of the tribes, Nachshon, the son of Aminadab, stepped forward. And he stepped into the sea. And nothing happened. And he went in up to his knees. And nothing happened. And up to his belly button. And nothing happened. And up to his chin. And nothing happened. Only when Nachshon ben Aminadav got into the water over his nose did the seas finally part. And when they parted, the rest of the Israelites could walk through on dry land. And I think you have shared with us that we're at a Nachshon moment, that we need a moment of faith. And that's faith in the African American community for the Jewish community, and faith in the Jewish community for the African American community. We need to repair the breach. There's just work to do. You have already pointed the way in Atlanta, where your church and the Reformed congregation, the Temple, are engaged in ongoing dialogue and ongoing projects to repair the world. The ending mass incarceration is unquestionably a work of tikkun olam, of repairing our universe. But I want to ask you, many of the people on this call are in smaller congregations or in communities that are much more segregated, to be honest. They're in very white communities, they're very Black communities. How do we get across the divide? How do we begin to re-engage? Can you give us some just very practical advice? If we're in a congregation and we want to do something, how do we do it?
So I think that in some cases, some of the relationships exist, but I think that we don't give them enough time and the intentionality, and we leave it at, well, we're going to have the meal together, or we're going to, and then that'll happen once a year, or it'll happen every 6 months. But I think it's, how do you take that to the next level of relationship building? So, building a sense of how do we intentionally be in relationship together, but also, how do we then how do we then find ways to act together in our local community? It was interesting last night. I was on a call with pastors in Columbus, Georgia, and as part of our ending mass incarceration work and listening. And it was so clear that, some of the greatest challenges they have are very local. They're very local in terms of governance. They're very local in terms of what the implementation is. And that there's opportunities even in a Columbus where it doesn't take, a whole bunch of congregations. I mean, it just is a small number who are, who would challenge. Like, it's one of the few cities in the country where they still have work camps, and so they use these work camps, as a way to supplement, they supplement city jobs so they don't have to spend that kind of money on their city budget. But it's a very local issue. And so, why not congregations that are local, Jewish, Christian together, who are beginning to work and advocate around those specific issues. So I think the importance of relationship building with some intentionality beyond the one meal together a year, as well as what is it that we can do? What is it that we think we can do together and affect together in our local community in terms of local governance, in terms of local issues?
Sorry, it took me a minute to unmute there. I'm people who know me know I'm not used to being muted at all. John, you're right. We need to do outreach, and we need to join together. I just want to share a couple of initiatives that I'm engaged in at JTS, and maybe that will also help model the kind of thing that you're doing at Ebenezer and the temple. The truth of the matter is that one of your pastors at Ebenezer and one of the rabbis at the temple are part of a study group that I'm in with clergy. It's Black clergy and it's Jewish clergy. And we represent 5 different cities: Atlanta, New York, Detroit, Chicago, and Seattle. And we meet once a month and we study a little Bible together. And then after Bible study, we do a little bit of sharing best practices, which is a nice way of saying we reaffirm one another and try and give one another strength. And one of the things I found is that we are building what the Reverend King and you might have called the beloved community. I look forward every month to being with my clergy colleagues. And obviously that enhances the top down that we can build. And there needs to be leadership for top down. But the truth is we also need grassroots work. And that's why I'm very proud that our seminary is engaged with a neighboring church in Harlem, St. Matthew's Baptist Church. And the Reverend Lisa Jenkins and I lead a study group. It met last night. And we're reading Genesis together, which is all about the dysfunctional family. And let's be honest, we're all experts in the dysfunctional family. And we begin to build relationships. The question, I think, and one of the people on the call has sent this question in, is how do you get people to stay at the table? I will confess to you, John, that when you said the letters BDS, I got really nervous. And we know that some of the things that happened with the Black Lives Matter movement were not positive for Black-Jewish relations. And I'm sure that there are things that we in the Jewish community do that enrage the Black community. How do we keep people at the table? How do you stay in it for the long run? And the long run may even be just a year or two until we really build a bond. But how do you fight the fact that in churches and synagogues, there will be members of the board who are very resistant to this? What do you recommend?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's also where I think I really am a big believer in the importance of relationships and relationship building, because, as I said earlier, mean, one of the key parts to making the Ending Mass Incarceration Initiative work was Pastor Warnock and Peter Berg had a pre-existing relationship, and they've been tending that relationship for a long time. And so when we shifted into action, there was not this kind of having to feel each other out, and we just went into action. And so it was a very natural movement for us. And so I think there's a lot to be said for the importance of getting to know the people. And I think it's through the relationships and getting to know each other as people allows us to stay at the table, which says, I know you because you're a parent just like I am, or you're struggling with how we walk in that world just like I am. And I think those say, I may not agree with you, but I know you and I know your heart. And so because I know that, I'm willing to kind of take this step with you together. So I don't, it's a relationship building that's not superficial. It's a relationship building that has some depth to it, and that also really is one. And I think that the faith rootedness is important too. I think that sometimes we don't trust enough, the presence of God in the midst of those relationships, and that, to provide that for those transformative moments to happen. So I think that that's important. The other thing, Burt, I want to just say, one of the other JTS relationships I know that has taken place, I saw Rabbi Stephanie Risquet on here, and I know Stephanie we've done some work together, both when I was at Auburn, but I know Stephanie has had a good relationship with a community-based organization in Harlem that I'm on the board of, the Brotherhood Sister Soul, and that kind of work. And I know that they have been grateful for those moments of connection. And so I think those kinds of partnerships and relationship, building, I think they go a long way in terms of our knitting together kind of what the new relationships look like today.
You're obviously absolutely totally right, and I encourage everyone to begin, if you don't already have relationships, begin building those relationships. Stephanie also sent me a note reminding me, and I'm so grateful for Rabbi Risquet because she really labors in this vineyard. Talk about terroir. She produces rich fruit, and she has reminded me that one possibility is that in the Jewish community is not uniformly white, and there are Jews of color, and Jews of color, be they 10 to 20% of the community, I don't know the exact number, but a significant group, they can also help, I think, bridge the gap between the African-American Christian community and the white Jewish community with Jews of color. So that may be yet another venue. On the other hand, we can't put the entire burden on them, and we do need to build. We need to build, as some of the questions have come in, by encouraging other rabbis and other Christian Black clergy to do this kind of outreach, do these kind of relationships. We need, and I'm delighted to say that at JTS, our rabbinical students are working on the issues of mass incarceration. But I know that there are people on the call. I know this because there have been a number of questions, and I'd like you to address it because you know him personally and work with him. There is some concern that the Reverend Warnock has been tarred in the press as being anti-Israel. And I could respond to that, but far better for you, who are his partner at the church, to speak to that issue. Are you willing to address that for us?
I get to address the easy issues today. So let me say it's really not mine to kind of speak to for him, I think on this. And I think he's been public in terms of his kind of his relationship, particularly like his relationship with the temple, his relationship with the Jewish community. So it's like, I think this is, it's part of how you stay in the conversation, but it's not mine necessarily to speak to, I think for him, but I do know that he, certainly in terms of our work with the local Jewish community and national Jewish community, both here with the temple, but also through the Auburn Senior Fellows and through other tables, I think that he has, I have observed him to have strong relationships both within the Jewish community as also in the Muslim community. And so, I can't really speak to, I can't speak to kind of the policy part in terms of his, kind of the relationship with Israel, but I can speak to, I see those relationships every day, and they are authentic and they have integrity. And, I think some are questions for him, for him to be able to reflect on beyond what he's said already publicly.
Thank you. I want to say, as someone who is publicly myself identified with J Street, which is a Zionist organization, pro-Israel, but is often reviled by the Jewish right, that I'm very sympathetic to Reverend Warnock, that if you raise any eyebrow towards Israel, there will be some reaction in the Jewish community, and people will get very upset about it. And I've certainly, and I probably will after this call too, get critiqued for it. But that said, when I was asked the question well before today, why I asked someone from Reverend Warnock's church to engage when Reverend Warnock, it was so well known, was anti-Israel, I pointed out that he wasn't, not only was he not anti-Israel, but in fact, he had been endorsed by the American Jewish Committee, which I think is still pretty mainstream. So I don't have any worries, and I do think that the Reverend Warnock going forward will be like a good friend, someone who will critique Israel, but also support Israel. And so I'm willing to hold that forth as a hope. Someone wrote, and I'm very intrigued what you think about this, that maybe the vice president could be a good place for Jewish-Black relations to start, since she seems to be very good at Jewish-Black relations in her own family. What do you say to that? Is Kamala Harris a leader? Can she and Doug be representatives of this burgeoning movement that we're trying to birth here today, John?
Well, I think that they can certainly, I think they can both model and also set the table, and I think can bring and can be a rallying, be one of many rallying places and rallying points. So yeah, no, I think that is definitely, that definitely has possibilities, I think, for us. I want to come back just, I think, to the, I think what's going to be important in, in this, in these harder conversations for us is, is kind of in our communities is to not necessarily walk away and say, well, he's this or he's that or but my challenge for us is to kind of stay engaged, stay at the table, and figure out what is it that we are able to do together, even though there will be nuances and things we agree to and not agree to, but the importance of kind of sticking with this and walking these roads together, and and for us to not not shy away from the discomfort of these moments. And I think that part of, I think also what the kind of the vice president and her husband will be able to do is be able to set a table and set a framework and be able to model kind of these opportunities to to kind of be in this together in all of its stickiness and discomfort, as well as the joy and the possibilities.
Amen, brother. Amen. I will confess to you, John, that one of the reasons I invited you to be our speaker today is I miss you here in New York. It was always good knowing you were across the street from JTS at Auburn, and that we could make good trouble together. And I think even with you in Atlanta, we're going to continue making good trouble together. I know you'll be coming back to New York since your wife is still in New York. But I do hope that this is an ongoing engagement, and that our community and the community of people who are on this call can look forward to engaging with the Ebenezer Church and with the African American community as we work for not only social justice at large, but the relentless pursuit of racial justice. There's just so much work to be done. I want to remind everyone this Monday and Martin Luther King Day, which is also the week of the inauguration, we all have an opportunity to do social service. If you go onto the Biden Inaugural Committee website, you can just Google it. You will find plenty of opportunity to do your own social justice work. And I hope all of you will do some outreach and take to heart I think, the charge that John has given us. Thank you, Reverend Vaughn, for your great Torah. And we look forward to other opportunities to engage. And thank you all for being on this call. And for those of you who celebrate, Shabbat Shalom.